5,000 years ago, in the deserts of Mesopotamia, something impossible happened. A civilization appeared that seemed to skip the awkward steps of growth. No crude experiments, no hesitant scratches on clay, no slow rise from scattered huts. Instead, Sumer arrived already armed with writing, astronomy, mathematics, laws, and monumental cities, as if someone had pressed reset and loaded a civilization already designed. Where did it come from? How could the world's supposed first civilization be so advanced that its systems still govern our lives today? 60 minutes in every hour, 360 degrees in every circle, contracts and codes that read like they were drafted by modern bureaucrats? The official story says they invented it all, but the silence beneath the sands suggests something else. That Sumer may have been rebuilding from fragments of a world erased, a memory too dangerous or too sacred to forget. Settle in, let the noise of the day fade, and join me as we follow those fragments scattered across myth, stone, and star. Tonight we'll step into the silence of lost worlds and ask what it really means to rebuild civilization from the ashes of the unknown. The desert night stretches endless over Mesopotamia, cool wind moving across dunes that have buried countless forgotten settlements. Silence reigns here, but if we press our imagination against the darkness, we can almost hear it, the murmur of marketplaces, the sound of clay tablets being pressed with styluses, the chants of priests climbing temple stairways under starlight. Yet this scene belongs to a paradox. When Sumer steps into history, it does so not with hesitant beginnings, but with full orchestration. Civilization, as we are taught, should emerge slowly. We expect an evolution from small farming villages to clustered hamlets, then to fortified towns, and only after centuries to large complex cities with governments and writing. But in Sumer, this sequence seems to collapse. The first glimpse we receive of this culture already reveals a world of cities like Uruk and Eridu, each populated by tens of thousands, each with canals, granaries, temples, and record keepers. There is no long record of fumbling experimentation. Sumer appears, as if from behind a curtain, already fluent in the grammar of civilization. The archaeologist Leonard Woolley, working in the 1920s at the site of was shocked by what he found. Beneath layers of ordinary domestic structures, he uncovered entire neighborhoods of streets laid out with surprising order, drainage systems running beneath, and administrative buildings where tablets detailed land sales, taxes, and contracts. He expected to find crude forerunners of writing, marks that suggested counting or property ownership. Instead, he found complex records, contracts signed by witnesses, trade ledgers balancing weights of silver, and hymns composed for the gods. Did not look like a civilization in its first experiments. It looked like one already seasoned. This impression deepens when we turn to Eridu, called by the Sumerians the first city. Excavations there revealed not just one temple but 17, each built upon the ruins of the previous. Rather than improvisation, what we see is repetition, layer after layer maintaining the same plan, as if the builders feared deviating from an inherited design. Each new generation did not attempt novelty, but recreated the form faithfully, preserving alignments and dimensions. If this was invention, it was an invention obsessed with copying itself. If it was memory, it makes perfect sense. Uruk, which by 3100 BCE held perhaps 80,000 people, forces the same question. How could a settlement leap almost overnight into being one of the largest urban centers in the world? Within its walls rose the Eanna district, dedicated to the goddess Inanna, and the Anu ziggurat, aligned with the movements of the heavens. Kilns fired pottery for mass production, workshops shaped copper and bronze, and scribes worked in schools, idaba, to train new generations. None of this looks like a culture groping its way into order. It looks like a society unfolding a blueprint. If we ask how this helps us understand our title, what if Sumer rebuilt human civilization from an ancient race? The answer lies in these anomalies. A civilization that invents itself should leave evidence of trial and error. We should see failed writing systems, irregular cities, haphazard attempts at large-scale architecture. Instead, we see maturity without childhood. This is the signature of preservation rather than innovation, as though survivors of an earlier world, carrying fragments of memory, reassembled a civilization already complete in outline. The details whisper this possibility. Clay tablets speak not only of daily rations of barley and beer, but of star positions, mathematical tables, and hymns with layered metaphor. In drainage channels were built with an understanding of water pressure far beyond trial-and-error ditches. In Residue, the alignment of temples mirrored celestial markers with precision. Everywhere we look, we see systems too complex to explain as a first attempt. They feel like instructions executed from memory, perhaps incomplete, perhaps imperfect, but recognizable as the restoration of something older. The Sumerians themselves hinted at this. Their king lists spoke of rulers before the flood, whose reigns stretched back tens of thousands of years. They saw their own culture not as the beginning, but as a continuation. The Great Flood myth, preserved in the Eridu Genesis and later echoed in the Epic of Gilgamesh, places the founding of Sumer after catastrophe, after the waters receded and new kingship descended from heaven once more. In other words, they framed themselves as rebuilders, not originators. Pause for a moment and picture it. The Tigris and Euphrates swell with life after the chaos of floods. Survivors gather in camps, holding fragments of memory, how to make bricks, how to measure fields, how to record accounts. Slowly they rebuild, not by invention, but by recollection. A child learns to draw wedge-shaped marks on clay, not because his people invented the script yesterday, but because the tradition had to be restored to prevent loss. A mason lays bricks in a ziggurat according to ratios handed down from generations before. To the archaeologist, it looks like sudden invention, but to the survivors, it is memory turned tangible again. And so we stand at the threshold of this paradox. If Sumer was the first civilization, why does it look already old? If it invented writing, why are the earliest tablets so advanced? If it built the first cities, why are those cities already planned with sophistication? The evidence suggests not invention, but inheritance, not genesis, but restoration. The door that opened in Sumer is not the door to humanity's beginning. It may be the door to remembering what humanity once was and what it had nearly lost. Beyond it lies a silence of forgotten predecessors, of erased blueprints, of civilizations drowned or burned. But in the clay of Sumer, in its streets and temples, we hear echoes of that silence being filled again, deliberately, insistently, as if to say, civilization must not be forgotten. Tonight, as we begin this journey, let us listen carefully to that first whisper, to the paradox of beginnings that are not beginnings at all. For when the door opens in Sumer, it may not be an entrance, but a re-entrance, an old story retold, a memory rebuilt in the sands of Mesopotamia. The Mesopotamian plain is a land of layers, each generation built upon the ruins of the last, so that when archaeologists dig, they read history as one might read a stack of manuscripts, page after page, era after era, pressed into earth. Normally, the story unfolds gradually. In other regions, we see villages becoming towns, towns swelling into cities, pottery shifting from crude to refined, tools evolving from simple to sophisticated. Civilization usually leaves behind a long trail of apprenticeship, a record of learning as people climb toward complexity. But in Sumer, the trail breaks. Beneath the sand, the silence is too smooth. The expected pages of trial and error are missing, as if torn from the book. When Leonard Woolley led his excavations at in the 1920s and 30s, he anticipated the usual arc: layers of broken huts, crude ovens, makeshift drains, precursors that would explain how a great city grew. Instead, his team found neighborhoods with engineered drainage channels, courtyards aligned with care, and records of property sales inscribed with legal precision. Where were the false starts? Where was the debris of invention? It was as though the city had appeared in one act, skipping rehearsal entirely. Uruk deepens the puzzle. By 3100 BCE, it was already a metropolis, perhaps the largest city on Earth, home to 50,000 to 80,000 people. Within its walls lay the Eanna temple precinct, dedicated to Inanna, with monumental buildings constructed of thousands of baked bricks. Canals ran through the city, regulating water flow and trade. Workshops produced ceramics in bulk with molds, a level of standardization that suggests coordinated planning. And all of this was accompanied by writing, not the clumsy pictographs of a society experimenting, but full cuneiform, recording grain rations for workers, hymns to the goddess, and contracts with witnesses. Archaeologists expected clumsy sketches. They found bureaucratic fluency. Residue tells a similar story. Beneath its temple mound, Woolley and later excavators uncovered 17 successive temples, each built atop the ruins of its predecessor. Far from experimentation, the repetition showed fidelity to a design carried across centuries. Each temple faced the same direction, with foundations laid in the same pattern, as if architects were obeying instructions more than innovating. Why copy so carefully unless what mattered was not creativity, but preservation? It was as though the builders were guardians of a blueprint they dared not alter. Even outside the great cities, the silence speaks. At Shurapak, early levels show sudden bursts of organization. Houses built in rows, central granaries, streets aligned deliberately. At Lagash, irrigation canals appear engineered with sophisticated hydrology from their first layers, ensuring fields were watered evenly. If these communities had grown organically, we would expect chaotic streets, inconsistent canal depths, gradual improvement. Instead, what we see looks like knowledge applied from the beginning, knowledge remembered rather than discovered. How does this absence shape our view of Sumer's beginnings? The silence beneath the sand may not be emptiness at all, but the residue of forgetting, an earlier chapter wiped away by flood or fire, leaving only faint blueprints in memory. When survivors built again, they did not stumble blindly through centuries of trial and error. They drew from what remained in story, in ritual, in fragments of instruction. To us, it looks like a miracle of sudden advancement. To them, it may have felt like restoration, the reassembly of memory rather than invention. Archaeologists sometimes speak of missing strata. At Uruk, between prehistoric levels and the great urban boom, there are gaps where one expects transitional evidence. At domestic debris disappears under carefully ordered streets. At Kish, traces of proto-writing are thin, yet the next layers yield standardized cuneiform. These missing layers are like pauses in a song, moments where sound should be but is not. The silence itself becomes the message. Something was lost, something we cannot see. Imagine walking across the site of at dusk. Dust settles on the outlines of ancient walls. Beneath your feet lie centuries of lives, children born, pots broken, prayers whispered. Yet deeper still lies the silence, the absence of the first messy steps. The archaeologist's trowel moves carefully, but there is nothing there. No crude drainage trenches, no half-built temples, no abandoned scripts. Only the sudden bloom of a finished civilization. This paradox unsettles because it suggests continuity rather than invention. Civilization does not emerge from a clean slate. It rises from memory, and when those memories are strong enough, they can leap across gaps, making the silence appear seamless. The question is not only what the Sumerians built, but what they remembered. Perhaps the silence is not accidental. Perhaps it was imposed by floodwaters that washed away entire landscapes, by conquest that razed earlier towns, by time erasing fragile experiments. What remains to us is only what endured in story and instruction. The physical traces may be gone, but the knowledge resurfaced in Sumer, carried forward by survivors who knew too much to start from nothing. At the edge of this thought, we return to the paradox. Sumer is celebrated as the first civilization, yet it looks ancient even in its youth. That unsettling gap, that absence of infancy, whispers of inheritance, which leads us to wonder, if the silence beneath the sand hides memory, then whose memory was it? And how far back does the story truly go? If you find yourself drawn to these mysteries, join the journey. Subscribe, so we can keep walking deeper into forgotten worlds. And tell me, do you think Sumer was truly first, or simply remembering what humanity had already lost? If you hold a Sumerian tablet in your hand, the clay feels rough, hardened by fire or time. The wedge marks pressed into it look simple, triangles and lines arranged in rows. But to trace those marks is to touch one of the deepest mysteries of history. Writing is supposed to be a gradual invention, clumsy at first, refined slowly across centuries. Yet the first cuneiform tablets of Sumer do not look like children's scribbles. They look like the work of masters. Consider how writing usually develops. In Egypt, hieroglyphs began as pictorial symbols, slowly abstracted over centuries. In China, early oracle bone inscriptions show variation, tentative efforts to standardize. Even in Mesoamerica, early glyphs are inconsistent, suggesting trial and error. But in Sumer, the earliest tablets we have, from Uruk and Jemdet Nasa, dating to around 3200 BCE, already record complex systems, tax accounts, legal contracts, hymns, and star catalogues. There are no proto-alphabets, no generations of pictographs groping toward abstraction. Instead, the first surviving words arrive fully equipped to govern cities. Samuel Noah Kramer, the great Sumerologist, often marveled at this. He translated tablets that contained not only inventories of grain, but sophisticated legal phrases. If a man gives silver to another as a loan, he shall repay with interest at harvest. Already we see conditional clauses, specialized vocabulary, and syntax that required generations to stabilize, except we find it at the beginning. Kramer called Sumer the cradle of civilization, but even he admitted it was as though writing had entered history fully grown. The Aduba, the tablet houses, or schools of Sumer, reinforce the point. Students did not practice with random doodles. They copied multiplication tables, legal formulae, hymns, and even lists of proverbs. These were not exercises in invention, but in preservation. The child's task was not to create a system, but to maintain one already perfected. Some school tablets even show teachers correcting students' hands, pressing the wedge deeper to ensure precision. The purpose was continuity. Writing was a memory machine. The texts themselves reveal the range. At Lagash, a tablet describes boundary disputes with precise geographic terms, as though surveying was already an ancient art. At Nippur, medical tablets list symptoms and treatments using specialized terminology that implies long traditions of practice. At hymns praise the goddess Inanna in carefully structured poetic lines, balancing metaphor with formulaic phrases. This is not the writing of a culture fumbling toward literacy. This is the archive of a society already fluent, already carrying forward traditions too old to date. The very shape of cuneiform reinforces its strangeness. The wedge marks are not intuitive symbols of objects like an ox head for ox. They are abstract, designed for speed and consistency, adaptable to multiple languages. Akkadian scribes later borrowed them seamlessly, writing in a completely different tongue. A system invented clumsily should be full of idiosyncrasies, hard to repurpose. But cuneiform function like software: modular, transferable, robust. Here we glimpse another thread in the paradox of Sumer. Cuneiform does not look like an invention in its infancy, but like a memory restored. Perhaps survivors of collapse did not recall every detail of the script, yet they remembered enough to rebuild its form. The earliest tablets are not baby steps at all, but backups, clay hard drives preserving fragments of an older system of thought. The Sumerians themselves hinted at this. They used the word sa to mean both to write and to preserve. To write was not only to create, but to safeguard against forgetting. Myths echo the same idea. The divine me, distributed by gods, often included the art of writing. It was not given as a new gift, but returned as a recovered one. To write was to restore what had been lost. Picture a scribe in Uruk around 3000 BCE. He sits cross-legged in a temple courtyard, clay tablets drying in the sun beside him. Around him, children chant multiplication tables, their voices echoing against the ziggurat walls. He presses wedge after wedge into the clay, recording contracts, harvests, star positions. Each mark is precise, unhesitating. He is not experimenting, he is remembering. His work is not invention, it is recovery. Even the myths tie into this. In the Epic of Gilgamesh, the hero carves his story onto stone tablets so that his memory will not fade. Writing is framed as the cure to forgetting, the tool that allows memory to survive death, flood, or time. In another hymn, the goddess Nisaba, patron of scribes, is praised not for creating writing, but for keeping the tablets, guarding the archives of heaven. When we line up these details, the silence becomes louder. If writing was truly born in Sumer, why does it look mature from its first appearance? Why does it seem designed, optimized, ready to endure? Why does it appear less as a newborn invention and more as a returning memory? The question lingers, echoing against the clay. What if cuneiform was not our first script, but our first backup drive? Look up at the Mesopotamian night sky, and you begin to understand why the Sumerians turned their eyes to the heavens. Without modern light, the dome above them was a tapestry of fire, the slow march of constellations, the flicker of wandering planets, the steady rhythm of the moon. To live beneath such a sky was to live inside a clock whose hands were written in stars. To read that clock required not just imagination, but mathematics, and in Sumer, that mathematics appeared with a strange maturity, as if it had never been young. Most number systems in the ancient world grew from the body. 10 fingers gave us base 10, 20 fingers and toes gave base 20, still visible in languages like French, but in Sumer the choice was 60. Base 60, or sexagesimal, is not obvious to the touch. It is, however, perfect for calculation. 60 divides evenly by 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, and 30. It is a mathematician's dream, a framework flexible enough to measure time, geometry, and the heavens. From the start, Sumer's mathematics was not a counting tool for shepherds. It was a cosmic instrument. The proof lies in the tablets. One of the most famous, YBC 7289, shows a simple square with its diagonal drawn. Next to it are numbers written in cuneiform wedges, an approximation of the square root of 2 accurate to 6 decimal places. This was 1800 BCE, more than a millennium before Greek mathematicians are credited with the discovery. The calculation is so precise that it is hard to imagine it as a first attempt. It looks instead like knowledge preserved, reapplied in a new setting. Other tablets contain multiplication tables, reciprocals, and even lists of regular numbers suitable for division. Babylonian descendants of Sumerian math preserved values for pi and trigonometric calculations that would not appear again until Indian and Greek traditions millennia later. Far from primitive, these texts show a numerical culture comfortable with abstraction, algebra, and precision. Why would a society just beginning to write already need such advanced mathematics? The answer may lie in the sky. The Venus tablet of Amisaduqa, though copied centuries later, is based on much older Sumerian observations. It records the risings and settings of Venus with astonishing accuracy, tracking an 8-year cycle. Other texts describe lunar eclipses, intercalary months, and planetary conjunctions. To record these, the Sumerians needed not just counting, but prediction. They were not just watching the sky, they were calculating it. Here the pattern we have seen before emerges again. A system that should take centuries to develop appears already polished. In Egypt, early mathematics focused on practical fractions and land measurement, simple and incremental. In China, early counting rods suggest gradual experimentation. But in Sumer, from the earliest layers, we see the full apparatus: base 60, reciprocals, roots, astronomical tables. It is as if someone handed them the finished toolkit. This is where the mystery deepens. Base 60 does not feel like a counting trick stumbled upon by shepherds, but like a framework inherited. Perhaps it came from a culture erased in floods, or from survivors who carried fragments of star knowledge across generations. In this light, the Sumerians were not inventing at all. They were reinstalling. Numbers were not created, they were remembered. The legacy still binds us. Every time you check your watch, you obey Sumer. 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour, 360 degrees in a circle. These conventions shape global science, navigation, and technology. The strange elegance of base 60 is embedded so deeply in modern life that we rarely question its origin. Yet its origin remains unexplained unless we see it as memory. Picture a Sumerian priest standing on the steps of a ziggurat. In one hand he holds a clay tablet etched with columns of numbers. In the other, a simple sighting rod. He watches the moon rise above the horizon, measures its position against the stars, and records it with symbols passed down from ancestors. Around him, torches flicker, casting shadows across the stairways. He is not experimenting. He is preserving, ensuring the rhythm of the cosmos is never forgotten. Even their myths reflect this obsession with numbers. The gods themselves were assigned numbers. Anu as 60, Enlil as 50, Enki as 40, Nana the moon as 30, Utu the sun as 20, Inanna as 15. The divine order was numerical, as though the universe itself was coded in base 60. In temples, hymns and rituals were performed in cycles of 60, echoing the cosmic framework. To the Sumerians, mathematics was not merely practical, it was sacred memory. And perhaps this is the key. Sacred systems survive collapses better than secular ones. If a civilization was destroyed, its practical manuals may vanish, but its rituals endure, carrying fragments of knowledge disguised as worship. When the survivors of catastrophe rebuilt in Sumer, they encoded the cosmos in numbers, embedding memory in mathematics so it could not be lost again. When we ask why base 60, why such precision, why so early, the silence beneath the question points us back to memory. The numbers are too elegant, the applications too advanced, to be the clumsy beginnings of civilization. They feel instead like the footprints of an older path, pressed into clay for us to follow. If writing preserved words, mathematics preserved the stars. Both arrived in Sumer, fully grown, as if reborn after forgetting. Both still govern our world. And both leave us wondering, were the Sumerians truly inventors, or were they guardians of a memory that reached beyond their time? The first light of morning touches the Mesopotamian plain, and on the horizon rises a mountain of brick. Tier upon tier, stairways climbing upward, its summit lost in haze. The ziggurat of Ur still dominates the land even in ruin, its core of baked clay stubborn against 4,000 years of weather. To walk among its stones is to walk inside memory, for these were not buildings of improvisation. They were monuments of preservation, vast repositories of knowledge encoded not in words but in form. Eridu, often remembered as the earliest Sumerian city, carries the clearest trace of this compulsion to preserve. Archaeologists uncovered not one temple but 17, stacked layer upon layer, each one a replica of the last. Imagine generations of builders returning to the same ground, clearing away the ruins, and laying new bricks in the same plane, the same alignment, the same proportions. Normally, architecture evolves, shrines grow larger, designs change, orientations shift with new priorities. But in Eridu, fidelity to the original was paramount. This was not creativity, but guardianship. Something about that plan, that alignment, that form, mattered more than novelty. It had to be preserved. The great ziggurat of Ur tells the same story on a grander scale. Built under King Ur-Nammu around 2100 BCE, it rose in 3 colossal tiers, each one aligned to the cardinal directions with mathematical precision. The stairways leading upwards symbolized ascent from earth to heaven, but they also functioned as practical markers, casting shadows that could measure time. Drainage channels, built into the structure itself, reveal a keen knowledge of engineering. Each brick was stamped with the king's seal, but the true authorship may have been older. These ratios, these alignments, did not belong to Ur-Nammu alone. They were echoes of a tradition already ancient in his day. To understand the ziggurats, we must see them not just as temples, but as instruments. Their size and shape mirror mountains, linking human cities with cosmic order. Their orientations mirror celestial events, embedding astronomy into architecture. and their repetition across cities and centuries suggests they carried memory forward. Each ziggurat was a data vault in clay and stone. This connects not to invention, but to remembrance. Ziggurats were not spontaneous creations, but deliberate reconstructions of designs carried from a forgotten world. Survivors may have remembered fragments of ratios, alignments, or myths that spoke of the mountain of the gods. In rebuilding, they encoded those fragments in brick, ensuring that what had been remembered would not be forgotten again. Even the smallest details reinforce the sense of preservation. Bricks used in sacred architecture were molded to exact dimensions, often inscribed with cuneiform texts dedicating them to a god. Thousands of such bricks have been found, each bearing witness not just to royal authority, but to the ritual act of repeating form. Archaeologists have even noted how ziggurats across Mesopotamia maintain proportional similarities despite being built in different centuries. It is as if the builders all worked from the same master plan, a blueprint transmitted through ritual and memory rather than written manual. The symbolism deepens this sense of continuity. To the Sumerians, the ziggurat was the axis mundi, the world axis connecting heaven, earth, and the underworld. It was a cosmic bridge. But a bridge implies connection, and connection implies continuity. Each time a ziggurat rose, it re-established the link between present and past, between mortal memory and divine instruction. The monument itself became a teacher, a stone library reciting the lessons of the stars. Picture it: a procession at dusk, priests ascending the stairways with offerings, chants rising in rhythm with their steps. The torches cast moving shadows across the brickwork, the smoke curling upward toward the sky. For the common people below, the ziggurat was a ladder to the gods. But for the architects, it may have been something else entirely, a way to preserve ratios, angles, alignments, and stories hidden inside the permanence of brick. The chants ensured the ritual survived. The bricks ensured the knowledge did. This perspective finds echoes at other sites. In Babylon, the ziggurat known as Etemenanki, House of the Foundation of Heaven and Earth, stood nearly 300 feet tall, its summit crowned by a temple said to touch the stars. Herodotus, writing centuries later, described its stages and stairways, noting how priests used the upper levels to watch the heavens. Here again, architecture served both ritual and science. To climb its stairways was to climb through layers of memory, each level carrying forward the legacy of earlier builders. If Sumerian cities looked fully formed, their monuments explain why. Architecture was not trial and error, but instruction. It was a way of carrying knowledge across floods and collapses, embedding survival in stone. Each ziggurat is less a temple to gods than a monument to memory, a rebuilt fragment of something older, preserved in geometry. In the shadow of these structures, the question deepens. If Sumer rebuilt from fragments, where did the fragments come from? Who first aligned stone with stars? Who first measured ratios in shadow? Who first carved the cosmic mountain in brick? The ziggurats point upward, but their real weight presses downward into the silence of forgotten ages. And as the sun sets, their silhouettes remain on the horizon, silent stairways rising into dusk, stairways that are not only architecture but archives. The memory of an older world lies inside their bricks, waiting for us to read it. The myths of Sumer shimmer with a quality unlike those of later civilizations. They do not only speak of thunder and lightning, of jealous deities fighting for power, of capricious gods playing games with humanity. Instead, the gods of Sumer behave as if they were administrators, planners, and, most curiously, teachers. Their stories are less about creation from nothing and more about distribution, how knowledge, roles, and responsibilities were handed out, city by city, people by people. In these tales, the divine is not only powerful, it is pedagogical. Take Enki, Lord of Wisdom and Fresh Waters. In the myth Enki and the World Order, he does not thunder down laws like Zeus or Yahweh. Instead, he travels across Mesopotamia, assigning duties to rivers, fields, craftsmen, and temples. To one city, he gives control of irrigation, to another the craft of bricks, to another the scribal art of record-keeping. His voice reads like a manager's report, not a song of gods. The specificity is uncanny, references to digging canals of precise depth or distributing the flow of water so fields receive even nourishment. Myth, yes, but myth that sounds like a manual. Ninhursag, the great mother goddess, takes another role. In Enki and Ninmah, she shapes humans from clay. At first glance, it seems like simple creation myth, but the text describes the proportions of water to earth, the kneading of clay until it holds shape, the careful moulding of bodies. This is not random imagery. These are the steps of pottery, the language of artisans. The act of divine creation doubles as a recipe for survival. Such patterns abound. The sun god Utu is not just a radiant figure in the sky, but arbiter of justice, patron of contracts, keeper of oaths. The goddess Nisaba is not merely divine inspiration, but the literal patron of writing, her name inscribed on tablets by scribes who thanked her for the gift of literacy. These gods are not metaphors for natural forces alone. They are guardians of domains of knowledge, each responsible for ensuring humanity remembers its allotted portion. Why encode practical instructions into myth? Because myth is durable. When libraries burn, clay tablets shatter, and languages vanish, stories remain. A child may forget numbers, but will remember a tale. Around a fire, in temples, across generations, myths travel where manuals cannot. By embedding irrigation techniques in Enki's decrees, or the ethics of trade in Utu's justice, the Sumerians ensured that their civilization's foundations were carried forward even if catastrophe struck again. This practice resonates less with invention than with survival. If civilization had collapsed once before, then encoding its lessons in myth was a strategy of endurance. The gods may not have been supernatural at all, but memories of teachers, figures from an older time who passed fragments of knowledge into the new world. In myth they are divine, but in memory they are instructors. Were the gods truly gods, or memories of teachers from an older world? Archaeological evidence hints at this dual role. A hymn to Enki preserved at Nippur includes long lists of crafts, trades, and offices. The carpenter, the potter, the brickmaker, the shepherd, the scribe. Each is named as a divine gift, but the list reads like a catalogue of professions required for an urban society. Another text praises Enki for inventing the plough, describing its design in technical detail. These are not vague poetic attributions. They are knowledge systems, reframed as gifts from heaven so that no one would dare let them lapse. Imagine a scene: dusk in Uruk, children gathered in a courtyard. A priest tells the story of how Enki once travelled to their city, bringing the gift of music, the art of weaving, the secrets of canal building. The children listen, wide-eyed, believing the gods walked among them, but hidden in the story are instructions: how to tune a lyre, how to cut reeds for baskets, how to direct water from the river. Myth becomes the delivery system for curriculum. The stability of these divine roles strengthens the case. In most pantheons, gods shift over time, their attributes changing with politics or conquest. In Greece, for example, Zeus absorbed roles from earlier deities. In Rome, gods were constantly syncretized with foreign imports, but in Sumer, Enki remains wisdom and water. Utu remains law and time. Nisaba remains writing. Their domains are fixed, like subjects in a school. That rigidity suggests they were less symbols of personality and more custodians of specific knowledge modules, unchanging because the knowledge itself could not be allowed to change. The Sumerians themselves hinted at this continuity. They called their gods the Anunnaki, those of heaven who came to earth, but always described them in roles of instruction. Kingship descended from heaven, but it arrived with laws. Writing was bestowed, but it came as a system already formed. These gifts were never depicted as clumsy experiments. They were restorations, returns, and so we must ask, if these myths carried practical instructions, were they preserving not only culture, but memory of an earlier civilization? Were the gods in truth the echoes of ancient teachers remembered in divine disguise? Imagine again the priest's voice echoing in the dusk, telling of Enki's decrees. The children hear stories of gods, but the adults nod in recognition. They know the story tells them how to manage the river when the floods come, how to measure the fields, how to record debts. The myth is sacred, but it is also survival. This is why Sumer's myths feel so strangely technical. They are not just stories about gods. They are blueprints disguised as devotion, fragments of knowledge buried in stone. They whisper of a past that was not invented in Sumer, but remembered there. Were the gods truly gods, or memories of teachers from an older world? In the quiet shadows of Eridu's temple, priests whispered a litany that was less like prayer and more like inventory. They spoke of the Me, divine decrees, sacred powers, the invisible architecture of order itself. Each Me was not an idea in the abstract, but a functional piece of civilization. To listen to these chants was to hear a catalogue of the very things that made urban life possible, spoken aloud as if they were treasures guarded in a chest. According to the myths, the god Enki stored the Me in his Abzu temple at Eridu, the subterranean palace of fresh waters. These Me were not vague symbols of prosperity. They were specific, enumerated fragments of culture: kingship, truth, weaving, carpentry, wisdom, writing, music, agriculture, prostitution, law, even negative aspects of society, falsehood, enmity, destruction, were listed as Me, for civilization includes not only light but shadow. The Me were civilization's code, and to control them was to control the shape of human life. One myth recounts how Inanna, goddess of love and war, travelled by boat to visit Enki. During their feast, Enki, perhaps drunk, perhaps careless, bestowed the Me upon her. Inanna loaded them onto her boat and carried them back to Uruk. When Enki realized what he had given away, he sent emissaries to stop her, but she prevailed, bringing the Me to her city. From then on, Uruk became radiant with culture, overflowing with crafts, music, festivals, and lore. The myth is both divine drama and allegory. Possession of the Me is what transforms a settlement into a civilization. Archaeologists have recovered lists of Me on tablets, and their specificity is startling. They read almost like software modules, distinct and transferable. To one city, kingship and law; to another, agriculture and canal building; to another, the arts of music and weaving. No single city held them all. Instead, each was a node in a distributed system, a puzzle piece of the greater whole. Just as computer code today can be divided into modules, the Sumerians envisioned civilization as a set of packets that could be allocated, lost, stolen, or restored. This illuminates not invention, but recovery. If fragments of knowledge survived from an earlier world, they may have been remembered not as unified systems, but as packets. Survivors might recall how to smelt metal, but not how to build ziggurats, preserve laws but forget astronomy. By encoding these domains as Me, the Sumerians ensured that fragmented memory could be carried forward. The myth of Inanna's theft becomes a metaphor for cultural restoration. One city reclaiming the modules, assembling them until civilization shines again. The distribution of knowledge across cities reinforces this. Uruk thrived in ritual and kingship. Nippur held religious authority. Lagash became a center of agriculture. Eridu remained sacred to water and wisdom. Each city specialized, each guarded its portion of the Me. Together they formed a network, not unlike scattered survivors pooling what they remembered to reassemble a lost system. Even the darker Me reveal insight. By listing deception, violence, and destruction alongside weaving and song, the Sumerians admitted that civilization is not purely progress. It carries within it the potential for corruption, exploitation, and war. These too had to be remembered, lest the reborn order collapse through naive forgetting. In their realism lies the suspicion that they had lived through collapse before. Imagine Inanna's boat gliding along the Euphrates under the pale light of the moon. The cargo is not gold or grain, but the invisible weight of knowledge, the craft of metalworkers, the hymns of priests, the laws of kings, the laughter of festivals. She brings them to Uruk, and in the morning, the city awakens changed. Its citizens are no longer mere survivors. They are heirs to a civilization reborn. To the people who heard these myths, the lesson was clear. Civilization is not something you invent once and keep forever. It can be lost, drowned in flood, burned in conquest. When that happens, you must recover the ME, gather the fragments, rebuild from packets. The story of Inanna is not just divine intrigue. It is a reminder that culture is fragile and that survival depends on preserving modules of knowledge, even when the whole is gone. The parallels to our own age are sobering. Today, knowledge is stored in servers, databases, clouds. If catastrophe struck, fragments might survive on hard drives, in scattered libraries, in stories whispered across generations. Future survivors might rebuild from those packets, reassembling fragments of a lost world. The Sumerians had already lived this cycle. Their ME were their cloud storage, their cultural backups, the invisible scaffolding of human order. When we look at those clay tablets now, listing crafts and laws beside cosmic decrees, they may seem quaint. But to the Sumerians, they were lifelines to a past nearly erased. Each ME was a thread binding them to ancestors they could not name, to a race or civilization lost to flood and time. By chanting them, by inscribing them, they kept those threads alive. The question lingers in the silence between lines of myth. Were the ME divine gifts from gods, or fragments of instructions salvaged from an older world, broken into packets, waiting to be reinstalled? The Mesopotamian rivers are gentle now, winding through fields of barley and reeds. Fishermen cast their nets, farmers tend their herds, and children play along the banks. It is difficult, standing here, to imagine water as an enemy. Yet the soil beneath their feet remembers a different story, one of violence, of overwhelming tides, of cities drowned in silt. For beneath the plain, archaeology uncovers evidence of catastrophe. At sites like Shuruppak, Kish and Ur, archaeologists found thick layers of riverine silt interrupting the sequence of human habitation. Ordinary debris, pots, hearths, tools, suddenly gives way to sterile clay, meters thick, deposited by floods. Above it, life begins again, as though a reset button had been pressed. At Shuruppak, the flood layer dates to around 2900 BCE. Some scholars argue it was a regional event, a massive inundation of the Euphrates that devastated cities and reset human settlement patterns. Yet the scale of memory attached to it suggests more than local disaster. For the Sumerians, the flood was not a storm of chance. It was the great erasure, the dividing line between what came before and what came after. The Eridu Genesis, one of the earliest flood stories, describes how the gods resolved to destroy humanity. Their complaint was curious. Humans were noisy, disturbing the divine rest. Enlil decreed their end. Yet Enki, the god of wisdom, whispered to a man named Ziusudra. He instructed him to build a massive vessel, sealed with bitumen, to carry his family, animals, and seeds of life. When the deluge came, Ziusudra's boat survived. After 7 days, he released birds to test the waters. When land emerged, he made offerings. The gods, chastened by their own violence, blessed him with eternal life. The parallels with the biblical story of Noah are unmistakable. A chosen survivor, a divine warning, a vessel, animals preserved, birds released, offerings made. The same sequence appears in the Epic of Gilgamesh, where Utnapishtim recounts to Gilgamesh how he too was warned by the gods and survived the flood. Beyond Mesopotamia, the echoes multiply. In India, the sage Manu is warned by a fish and builds a boat to survive cosmic waters. In Greece, Deucalion and Pyrrha build an ark and repopulate the world by casting stones behind them. In China, Yu the Great drains the floodwaters and restores order. Among the Inca, Viracocha saves humanity from drowning and brings survivors to high mountains. Even the Hopi of North America recall floods that forced their ancestors into caves to survive. This chorus of stories stretches across continents. How do we explain the same motifs appearing in cultures separated by oceans and centuries? Scholars often speak of archetypes, shared human fears of water, common experiences of seasonal flooding. Yet the details are too specific, too patterned. A warning, a vessel, the preservation of seeds and animals, the sending of birds, the renewal of life. These are not metaphors for rain. They are the preservation of memory, copied and recopied until the story became sacred. Here the flood myths act as a hinge in humanity's memory. They describe the destruction not of one town, but of a world order. Survival is framed not as chance, but as transmission. Knowledge, seeds, animals, and instructions carried across the waters of forgetting. The Ark is more than a boat. It is a library, a vessel of memory. What if every flood story is less about punishment and more about remembering how to rebuild? Geology adds weight to myth. At the end of the Ice Age, between 12,000 and 8,000 years ago, sea levels rose more than 120 meters. Entire coastlines vanished beneath the waves. Landscapes that once supported millions were swallowed. Doggerland, between Britain and Europe, became seabed. Sunderland, in Southeast Asia, drowned beneath the South China Sea. Black Sea flood theories suggest catastrophic connections between seas and rivers reshaping continents. To those who lived through it, the world itself seemed to dissolve. Survivors carried only what they could: stories, seeds, fragments of knowledge. Now imagine being one of them. The river you trusted swells into an unstoppable torrent. Fields, homes, temples, all vanish in days. You climb higher ground, clutching your children, your memory, your gods. When the waters recede, you return to mud where your city once stood. Nothing remains but the skills in your hands and the stories in your mind. To rebuild, you must remember. For the Sumerians, the flood was the great divider. Before it, the king lists describe reigns of impossible length, kings who ruled for tens of thousands of years, names that echo like myth. After it, reigns shrink to human scale. Civilization begins again, but the memory of vast antiquity lingers. To them, the flood was not just punishment, it was reset. Kingship descended from heaven once more. Cities were planted again. The ME were redistributed. The pattern restarted. This is why Sumer looks so advanced from its first moment. If an older world had been washed away, the survivors carried forward what fragments they could. They did not start from scratch. They reinstalled civilization, like loading saved files after a system crash. To us, it appears miraculous. To them, it was survival. As twilight falls over the Mesopotamian plain, we can almost hear the whispers of those survivors. Around their fires, they told of Enki's warning, of Ziusudra's boat, of the deluge that erased the world. Their children listened, repeating the story until the myth became scripture. The story was not only a warning, it was a manual: how to remember, how to preserve, how to rebuild. And so the flood myths echo across continents. They are not coincidences of imagination. They are fragments of human memory, scattered but convergent, telling us that we have been here before, that we have lived through erasure and learned to begin again. What if every flood story is less about punishment and more about remembering how to rebuild? In a quiet case in the Vorderasiatisches Museum in Berlin rests a small cylinder of stone, barely larger than a thumb. It is catalogued as VA243, one among thousands of Mesopotamian cylinder seals. At first glance, it looks like many others, a scene etched into stone, meant to be rolled across wet clay to mark ownership or record an event. But when its impression is unrolled and studied carefully, it becomes one of the most debated objects in the history of archaeology. The central motif shows a radiant star, its rays sharply carved, unmistakably meant to represent the sun. Around it are 11 small orbs, arranged in a loose circle. To most modern eyes, the pattern is immediately recognizable. A heliocentric solar system, the sun at the center, planets orbiting around. Some orbs are small, others larger, their sizes seemingly proportional, one noticeably large, like Jupiter, and one smaller, like Mercury. At least one is positioned where Uranus would be, a planet invisible to the naked eye until telescopes revealed it in the 18th century. Mainstream scholars offer cautious explanations. They suggest the star is a divine symbol, the orb's decorative elements, or perhaps constellations. They remind us that ancient artists did not intend literal astronomy but symbolic representation. Yet the arrangement nags at the imagination. Why 11? Why placed in this order around a central sun rather than scattered like stars? Most cylinder seals show gods, worshippers, animals. Few depict abstract clusters of spheres. VA213 seems different, more schematic, more deliberate. The puzzle deepens when compared with other Sumerian astronomical texts. The Sumerians tracked the movements of Venus with precision, noting its cycle of 8 years. They described Jupiter as accompanied by companions, a detail strangely evocative of its moons. They identified Saturn with handles or arms, an uncanny description of its rings. None of these details should have been visible to the naked eye, yet they appear in texts copied by scribes centuries before the invention of telescopes. Could the knowledge embedded in VA243 be part of the same pattern, fragments of advanced observation preserved, even if their origins were forgotten? If a culture before Sumer had mapped the heavens, its knowledge might have been carried in fragments, symbols, rituals, myths. VA243 could be one such fragment, not fully understood by the artisan who carved it, but preserved out of reverence. Perhaps it was less an invention of new astronomy than a memory of old astronomy, encoded in an object that survived long enough to puzzle us today. Consider the context. The seal was not a public monument, but a personal object, meant to roll across clay to leave its impression. Whoever owned it chose this image to represent authority, identity, or devotion. To them, it must have carried meaning. Was it a cosmic map, a reminder of divine order? Was it a way of connecting personal fate to the stars, or was it something more, that by carrying this symbol one aligned with a knowledge older than kings? The debate extends beyond VA243. Mesopotamian star lists catalogue constellations still in use today. Lunar eclipse predictions were recorded with accuracy rivaling modern calculations. The Mul. Apin texts copied from earlier sources preserve detailed instructions for observing the skies, marking solstices and equinoxes. These were not the stumbling steps of a new science. They were continuations of a tradition already advanced. VA243, then, may be one more clue in a pattern, that Sumer's astronomy was less an invention than a revival. Imagine the artisan carving VA243. He sits in a small workshop, turning the cylinder under his hand, etching with delicate strokes. Around him lie other seals, scenes of gods, cattle, marriages. But on this stone he carves a radiant sun, surrounded by orbs. He does not invent the image. Perhaps he has seen it on older tablets, or been taught its form by elders who say it is sacred. He does not know exactly what each orb means, but he knows the pattern must be preserved. When the seal rolls across clay, the cosmos itself leaves its imprint. For the Sumerians, astronomy was never only science. It was sacred order. The movements of planets dictated ritual calendars, agricultural cycles, and omens for kings. If VA243 encoded a solar system, then it was not idle curiosity. It was cosmic authority, proof that their civilization stood aligned with the structure of the heavens. And if that structure was inherited, then their legitimacy as rebuilders of civilization rested on carrying forward memory of the stars. Skeptics dismiss the seal as coincidence, but even coincidence reveals something. Why would a culture at the supposed dawn of civilization think to arrange orbs around a central sun? Why not scatter them? Why not portray only the moon and visible planets? The very choice suggests a perspective beyond what their time should allow. Whether by design or by accident of preservation, VA243 speaks with a voice older than itself. Standing before it in the museum, glass between you and the carved stone, you may feel the weight of that voice. The seal is small, yet it seems to carry the cosmos. It whispers of scribes pressing numbers into clay, of priests climbing ziggurats to track Venus, of myths where gods assign duties not only to people, but to stars. And behind those whispers, a deeper echo of an ancient race, an earlier civilization who mapped the heavens long before Sumer, leaving behind fragments like this to be puzzled over millennia later. The seal waits, silent in its case, its meaning debated, its message unresolved. But in its carved orbs, we glimpse again the possibility that Sumer was not beginning, but remembering. The cosmos itself may have been their textbook, and their artifacts its surviving pages. Do you think VA243 is just art, or a fragment of memory from an older world? If questions like this intrigue you, consider subscribing so we can keep exploring these mysteries together. At first glance, the hill looked ordinary. Dry grass bent in the Anatolian wind, sheep grazed across its slopes, and the scattered stones seemed no different from countless others in the Turkish countryside. To the villagers nearby, it was just another mound, one of many dotting the land. They called it Göbekli Tepe, the belly hill. Yet hidden beneath its surface lay something that would upend everything we thought we knew about human history. In 1994, archaeologist Klaus Schmidt began digging here. What he uncovered was not a scattering of primitive huts or crude tools, but circles of towering megaliths, some reaching 5 meters in height, weighing up to 20 tons each. They stood in carefully arranged enclosures, the stones carved into T-shapes and decorated with animals, foxes leaping, vultures with outstretched wings, snakes winding across the stone, wild boars frozen in motion. Some pillars were anthropomorphic, their surfaces bearing arms, belts, even loincloths, as though the stones themselves were guardians of memory. The shock was not only in the scale, but in the age. Carbon dating revealed Göbekli Tepe to be more than 11,000 years old, built around 9600 BCE, thousands of years before the Sumerians, before Stonehenge, before the Egyptian pyramids. Even more astonishing, this was before the agricultural revolution. Conventional wisdom tells us that farming led to surplus, surplus led to settlements, and settlements led to temples. But Göbekli Tepe breaks this sequence. Here was monumental architecture raised by hunter-gatherers, people who, by our textbooks, should have lacked the resources, organization, and skills to build on such a scale. How could they have done it? To quarry, transport, and raise stones of such size requires coordination, planning, and engineering. The carvings show artistic mastery and symbolic thought at a level far beyond survival needs. And the enclosures are not haphazard. They are aligned with astronomical events. Scholars have noted that some pillars may point to the rising of Sirius, while others align with solstices and equinoxes. The builders of Göbekli Tepe were not merely stacking stones. They were mapping heaven onto earth. Then comes the greatest mystery. The site was deliberately buried around 8000 BCE, not destroyed, not abandoned, but carefully filled with rubble and covered. The structures, still pristine beneath the soil, were sealed as if in a time capsule. This was no accident of erosion. It was intentional concealment, a conscious decision to hide a cathedral of stone from the world. Why would anyone go to such lengths? To protect it from invaders? To preserve it for the future? Or perhaps to bury it after its purpose was fulfilled, like closing a book no longer meant to be read? Göbekli Tepe stands as a haunting precedent. If such monumental skill existed long before farming, then the sudden sophistication of Sumer looks less like a miracle and more like continuity. The site could represent an earlier chapter of civilization, erased by time but preserved in memory. Its builders may have been the ancestors of those who later raised the cities of Mesopotamia, or perhaps part of a different lineage entirely, an ancient race whose knowledge lingered like embers, carried forward into Sumer's flame. Imagine the scene more than 10,000 years ago. Torches flicker in the cold night as shadows dance across the carved animals. The hunters and gatherers, who should by all logic be simple nomads, stand within the stone circles, chanting prayers to constellations they have mapped for generations. The stars above blaze with clarity. Below, the carved vultures and serpents watch in silence. This is not the birth of ritual. This is ritual already mature. sophisticated, aligned to cosmic order. It feels less like invention and more like remembering. When Schmidt realized the age of what he had found, he said it was like discovering a cathedral at the dawn of humanity. But perhaps it was not dawn at all. Perhaps it was twilight, the last visible glow of a far older world, deliberately buried to await rediscovery. If so, then Sumer's temples and ziggurats were not unprecedented creations. They were echoes, continuations of a design first inscribed in stone on this Anatolian hill. The burial raises another thought. To bury is to protect. Were the builders of Göbekli Tepe preserving something they feared would be lost? Did they sense catastrophe coming? Climate shifts, floods, social collapse? Or were they fulfilling a ritual of closure, ensuring their knowledge would survive in silence until a later age could uncover it? In this way, Göbekli Tepe becomes less an anomaly and more a messenger. It whispers across 10,000 years that civilization has deeper roots than we think. The silence of its stones connects back to Sumer. Both appear fully formed, both carry cosmic alignments, both encode memory in monumental form. But where Göbekli Tepe was buried, Sumer was raised. One preserved the past in silence, the other resurrected it in sound and clay. Together they suggest a cycle. Knowledge preserved, knowledge revived, knowledge buried again. Today, as you stand at Göbekli Tepe, the air is still, and cranes hover above the excavations. The megaliths rise from the earth like teeth of some colossal beast. Their carvings remain sharp, their presence undeniable. You feel not as though you are witnessing the beginning of human ingenuity, but as though you are trespassing in a memory too old to name. And so the question lingers: was Göbekli Tepe the first cathedral or the last monument of an older civilization? Was it invention or inheritance? Its stones do not answer, but their silence points us back to Sumer and the possibility that what we call the first civilization was only rebuilding from fragments hidden in places like this. The city of Nineveh once shimmered like a jewel of empire. Its walls stretched for miles, its palaces gleamed with reliefs of kings conquering lions and foreign lands. But its greatest treasure was hidden behind those walls, not in stone or gold, but in clay. Within the palace of Ashurbanipal, king of Assyria, in the 7th century BCE, scribes gathered tens of thousands of tablets. This was the royal library of Nineveh, an archive unlike any other, filled with the knowledge of Mesopotamia. Clay shelves held epics, hymns, rituals, law codes, astronomical diaries, omen texts, and medical prescriptions. Ashurbanipal boasted that he could read Sumerian and Akkadian, that he had mastered the writing of his ancestors. He commanded his scribes to copy from every archive of the land, to bring the wisdom of the ages into one place. In those rooms, history converged. There you could find the Epic of Gilgamesh, copied from older Sumerian stories. There you could read astronomical observations stretching back centuries. There, too, were diagnostic handbooks that catalogued hundreds of illnesses with remarkable detail. It was as though the king knew civilizations crumble and wanted to preserve memory against the tide. But in 612 BCE, Nineveh fell. The Babylonians and Medes sacked the city, setting its palaces aflame. Fire swept through the library. Papyrus scrolls would have turned to ash, parchment to smoke, but clay is different. The flames that were meant to erase hardened the tablets like pottery. When the walls collapsed and the library was buried, the texts survived. Centuries later, when archaeologists uncovered them, the tablets spoke again. The great irony is that destruction preserved what peace might have lost. Still, Nineveh was an exception. For every library that survived by accident, countless others vanished. At Uruk, the city of Inanna, archives were destroyed when temples fell into ruin. At Residue, storehouses were emptied, their tablets broken and scattered. At Nippur, scholars found only fragments, crumbled beyond repair. Across Mesopotamia, war, fire, flood, and neglect consumed knowledge. Each conquest erased not only walls but words. Each lost tablet was a thread severed from humanity's memory. This is the deeper shadow cast across Sumer's legacy. If fragments of older worlds survived into their cities, they must have depended on archives, collections of clay, story, and ritual. When those archives burned or dissolved, we were left with mysteries. We see sudden sophistication because the manuals, the intermediate notes, the explanatory texts are gone. Civilization looks like magic when its documentation has perished. Irving Finkel, curator at the British Museum, has often spoken of this paradox. He describes how we are astonished by Sumer's advances, yet our astonishment is born of absence. We only have fragments, enough to dazzle, but not enough to explain the full picture. If half the tablets of Mesopotamia had survived, we might understand how knowledge truly flowed. Instead, we live among ruins of thought. We hear echoes but not the full song. Imagine a Sumerian scribe at Nippur sitting by lamplight. He takes a lump of clay, moistens it, and presses a stylus carefully, copying older texts line by line. He believes he is securing memory for generations. Yet centuries later, his tablets are shattered, their shards scattered through dust. His work is lost, not because he failed, but because time and conquest made his world vanish. This cycle of preservation and loss shapes the way we view antiquity. We marvel at sudden brilliance, mathematics, astronomy, law, yet perhaps these were only the visible survivors of a broader system now gone. Sumer may not have been anomalous at all. Its apparent leaps may be the footprints of continuity, fragments of memory that escaped erasure. What seems miraculous is only what survived the fire. The silence of missing libraries is as loud as the words we still possess. It is there in the gaps between texts, the unexplained jumps in sophistication, the myths that sound like manuals without their appendices. It is there in the stories of gods handing down the ME, in fragments of astronomical lists that assume prior knowledge, in laws that appear already standardized. The silence tells us we are looking at survivors of a deeper archive, one whose shelves we will never see. Today, the tablets of Nineveh sit in glass cases, their wedge marks as sharp as the day they were pressed. They speak to us across 2,600 years of burial. But for every tablet here, how many more dissolved in mud or were ground into dust by invaders? How many myths, calculations, maps, and instructions have been erased forever? Civilization's memory is patchwork, stitched from what the flames and floods did not take. And so, when we stand in front of these fragments, we are not seeing the full civilization. We are seeing what survived catastrophe, what endured silence. Our awe at Sumer may be misplaced, not because its achievements were unworthy, but because they were never meant to stand alone. They were chapters of a longer book, most of whose pages have burned. The Library of Nineveh is a miracle of survival, but it is also a reminder of loss. For every room of hardened tablets, there are countless empty shelves, erased voices, forgotten instructions. The true archive of humanity lies not only in what has been found, but in what will never return. And so the question deepens. If even Sumer's restorations are filtered through loss, how much more have we forgotten from the worlds that came before? Deep in the archives of the world's museums, scholars bend over clay tablets, tracing wedge-shaped marks pressed by hands thousands of years gone. The tablets are mute in one sense. They no longer have readers who speak their tongue. But through painstaking work, linguists breathe a kind of half-life into them. Yet even as they translate, shadows remain. No word embodies this uncertainty more than Anunnaki. To the Sumerians, the Anunnaki were a council of powerful beings. But what kind of beings? Here language becomes slippery. In its most straightforward form, the word can be broken down. Anu, the sky god, and Naki, which scholars variously render as of earth, seed, or offspring. Enti text. Taken literally, Anunnaki could mean the princely seed of Anu, those of heaven who came to earth, or simply the gods. Which of these is correct? The answer depends less on the tablets than on the translator's assumptions. In one text, the Anunnaki sit in judgment, assigning fates. In another, they descend from the heavens to instruct humankind. In others still, they appear as ancestors, linked to the cycles of kingship. Modern interpreters disagree. To some, they are simply deities, comparable to the Olympians of Greece. To others, they are more like civilizing heroes, mythologized figures who brought knowledge. And to yet others, they may represent memories of actual instructors, remembered through the lens of myth. The difficulty lies in Sumerian itself. Unlike Akkadian, Greek, or Latin, Sumerian has no daughter languages. It is a linguistic orphan, agglutinative and complex, with meanings that shift depending on context. A single sign might represent multiple syllables, multiple words, multiple concepts. Without living speakers to guide nuance, translators must guess. What one renders as gods, another might render as princes, another as those who came down. The same wedge can carry different worlds. This ambiguity matters because language shapes interpretation. If we call the Anunnaki gods, then the stories are myth, poetic allegory. If we call them princes, they become political history, rulers of early cities. If we call them those who came down, we hint at something else entirely. Figures from elsewhere, bearers of knowledge from beyond the visible horizon. The texts do not fix the choice, they allow it. They whisper possibilities without closing them. Consider the myth Enki and the world order. The Anunnaki are listed as distributing functions: farming, irrigation, weaving, carpentry. This is not the behavior of abstract deities, but of administrators. Or take the Atrahasis epic, where the Anunnaki toil to dig canals and raise cities until they rebel, forcing the creation of humankind to take on the labor. Are these gods in the divine sense, or are they cultural memory of a class of teachers, builders, perhaps survivors of a previous world who instructed the Sumerians? Translation cannot tell us. It can only show the ambiguity. This connects not to invention, but to memory's echo. If there was an older race or culture behind the stories, the Anunnaki may be their shadow. Perhaps they were remembered as gods because their knowledge seemed supernatural. Perhaps their role as distributors of the ME, the building blocks of civilization, reflects fragments of instruction carried into Sumer from earlier ages. But if so, the truth has been obscured by language. The wedges preserve the syllables, but the meaning slips away. Imagine Professor Elena Kazakova late at night in her office at Columbia, scanning transliterations of Sumerian texts. On her desk are dictionaries, grammar charts, and photos of tablets. She pauses at the word Anunnaki, knowing full well the debate it carries. She chooses gods for the translation, but writes in the margin, could also mean those of the heavens who came to earth. She knows her choice will shape how students read the myth. She knows it may not capture the full intent, but there is no other option. The living context is gone. This fragility of meaning is itself part of the mystery. Words are not only signs, they are vessels of memory. When a language dies, memory dies with it. What survives is skeletal, half-lit. The Anunnaki may have been gods, teachers, rulers, or ancestors, but the living nuance is irretrievable. All we can do is circle the word, tracing its shadows, never touching the whole. And yet the Sumerians themselves left clues in how they used the word. They placed the Anunnaki in contexts of teaching, assigning, building, instructing. They did not thunder like Zeus or hurl storms like Thor. They allocated crafts, designated roles, managed order. Their function seems more technical than divine. If gods are memory turned into symbol, then perhaps these gods were memories of instructors, real or imagined, whose roles were too important to forget. Picture a temple courtyard in Ur, where priests chant lists of the Anunnaki. To the crowd they are divine powers shaping destiny. To the priests they are guardians of knowledge. Enki for water and wisdom, Ninhursag for fertility and healing, Nabu for writing, Utu for law and solar time. Each name holds a domain, each domain a fragment of civilization. Whether divine or human in origin, the effect is the same. The Anunnaki preserve memory. Translation will never resolve the ambiguity. The wedge marks are too blunt, the contexts too distant. But perhaps that is the point. Perhaps the power of the Anunnaki lies not in certainty, but in possibility. They are gods to some, ancestors to others, teachers to others still. In their ambiguity, they reflect the fragility of all memory, the way it shifts, erodes, and survives only as echo. And so we are left with a question. If the Anunnaki were truly gods, then Sumer's myths are spiritual allegory. But if they were memories of teachers from another time, then the myths are instruction manuals disguised as stories, fragments of an older civilization embedded in sacred language. Which is it? The tablets will not say. They sit in silence, their wedges mute, their meanings fractured. The Anunnaki remain shadows on clay, waiting for us to decide whether they are divine, ancestral, or remembered teachers from an older world. In the vast basements of museums, among corridors where the public never walks, there are shelves stacked with clay tablets. They sit in neat rows inside acid-free boxes, their catalogue numbers written in tidy handwriting. Each one is a fragment of a world 4,000 years gone. Their wedge-shaped signs are clear enough, but their meanings remain locked. By some estimates, over 500,000 cuneiform tablets exist in global collections. Of these, perhaps only 20% have been read in detail. The rest remain silent, waiting in storage. On the surface, this seems like a problem of resources. Too few scholars, too many tablets, not enough time. Yet the silence carries another weight. Many of these unread tablets contain anomalies, details that do not fit the official story of history. When glimpses emerge, they are often tucked away, dismissed, or quietly set aside. Knowledge, like memory, can be buried not only by accident, but by choice. One of the more curious cases is a tablet catalogued as BM 145793, housed in the British Museum. When a researcher named Robert Hassan studied it in the mid-20th century, he claimed to find orbital values for planets written in precise sexagesimal notation. The numbers, astonishingly, matched modern calculations for Jupiter and Saturn. Hassan brought his findings to his mentors, expecting excitement. Instead, he was met with cool silence. The data was interesting but anomalous. His fellowship quietly ended, and the tablet was returned to the archives. Its wedge marks still sit there, but no one publishes on them. This is not conspiracy in the dramatic sense of secret police and locked vaults. It is the quieter mechanism of academic culture. Grants reward safe projects. Journals prefer incremental discoveries. Careers are built on consensus, not upheaval. Anomalies threaten reputations, so they are often set aside. Over time, neglect becomes erasure. The result is a silence as profound as any flood or fire. The irony is sharp. We lament the loss of the Library of Alexandria, yet we sit today atop an unread library greater still. In London, Berlin, Istanbul, and Baghdad, thousands of boxes hold texts that could change our understanding of the ancient world, but they remain unopened. When tablets are translated, they often contain prosaic records, lists of rations, receipts for sheep, deliveries of beer. Yet even among these, extraordinary fragments appear. Tables of lunar eclipses, strange geometric calculations, medical texts describing surgeries with surprising sophistication. What else lies waiting, untranslated, on those shelves? The problem is not only the unread, but the unreadable. Some tablets are damaged, their signs broken. Others use rare dialects or archaic forms. Still others resist translation because their vocabulary has no parallel in known contexts. Scholars sometimes suspect these tablets deal with lost sciences, rituals describing advanced metallurgy, or astronomical charts referencing unknown stars. But without context, the meaning drifts beyond reach. Here the question echoes again, not as invention, but as survival. If fragments of an older inheritance endured, they may lie hidden in precisely these neglected or anomalous tablets. Not in grand declarations, but in stray numbers, odd phrases, technical vocabulary, half understood by the scribes who copied them. To modern eyes, these fragments look like errors. To another lens, they may be fingerprints of memory, evidence that the Sumerians were preserving knowledge from a world already gone. The greatest flood today may not be water, but the silence of unopened archives. Imagine walking down a museum corridor late at night, the hum of fluorescent lights above, the air dry and still. Boxes line both sides, each holding tablets pressed by hands that once trembled with urgency. A scribe, 4,000 years ago, copied an astronomical chart, believing it would safeguard knowledge for eternity. Now it lies in the dark, unstudied, its signs gathering dust. Knowledge has not been destroyed by flood or flame. It has been shelved into silence. This raises a more uncomfortable point. Forgetting is not always natural. It can be curated. Choices about which texts to translate, publish, or teach shape our collective memory. Just as conquerors once burned libraries to erase their rivals, modern institutions can erase by omission. The result is the same: gaps in the story, silences mistaken for absence. Robert Hassan once said in an interview, "The greatest library of human antiquity is not Alexandria, which burned. It is these storerooms which remain closed." His words sting because they remind us that we live amid abundance, yet behave as if in famine. The answers may be in our hands, yet we avert our gaze. Picture the chain of silence. A scribe copies values of planetary motion. Centuries later, the tablet is excavated and carried to a museum. A catalogue number is assigned, but no translation is made. Decades pass. Scholars glance at it, frown at its oddities, and return it to the shelf. Generations later, it remains there, mute, neglected, waiting. The knowledge survives in form, but not in function. The memory exists, but only as artifact, not as meaning. What if within these storerooms lie tablets that would change how we see Sumer, not as the beginning of civilization, but as the reboot of something far older? What if the silence is not only about the past, but about us, our reluctance to ask dangerous questions, our fear of rewriting the story? Floods and fires erased by violence, archives erased by neglect. Which is more final? Perhaps the truest tragedy is not that we lost knowledge to catastrophe, but that we keep it hidden in plain sight, choosing silence over revelation. The wind over Antarctica is like no other sound on Earth. It howls across a desert of frozen time, whipping over mountains buried beneath kilometers of ice. This is a land where memory is locked away, sealed under white silence for tens of thousands of years. Beneath the sheets of glacial armor lie entire ranges. The Gamburtsev Mountains, as tall as the Alps, hidden from sight. Lakes like Vostok and Ellsworth, liquid and dark, sit isolated beneath 4 kilometers of ice, untouched by human eyes. In places, radar suggests ancient river systems, long entombed beneath the frozen crust. If there were traces of human settlement from a forgotten age, they would now lie invisible, preserved in darkness, unreachable by shovel or trowel. The idea unsettles us because it stretches our imagination backward, far beyond the neat story of recorded history. Could advanced societies have existed before the ice locked them away? If so, then what we call the beginning may be only a recovery, a reconstruction from scattered survivors. This is the unsettling resonance with Sumer. Their sudden sophistication may not be the first spark of civilization, but the rekindling of embers salvaged from worlds erased beneath ice and sea. Consider Doggerland, the lost country that once bridged Britain to Europe. 10,000 years ago, it was a lush plain of rivers, lakes, and forests. Archaeologists have found bone harpoons, mammoth tusks, and evidence of camps where families hunted and fished. Then, as sea levels rose after the last ice age, Doggerland vanished beneath the North Sea. Today, trawlers pull up artifacts from its seabed, stone tools, antler picks, mute reminders of a drowned homeland. Once a thriving place of life, now it is nothing but silence beneath the waves. Or look to Sunderland in Southeast Asia. At the peak of the Ice Age, much of Indonesia was one continuous landmass. Plains now hidden beneath the Java and South China Seas may once have hosted vast populations. Myths from the region speak of lands lost to the sea, ancestral homelands swallowed in floods. Even in Polynesia, Oral traditions recall islands sinking, survivors sailing to new homes. If fragments of these drowned cultures reached Mesopotamia, it might explain why Sumerian knowledge appears so sudden, so whole, as though carried from elsewhere. The Americas too hold their ghosts. In 2024, LiDAR scans revealed sprawling networks of plazas, causeways, and canals beneath the Upano Valley in Ecuador. For centuries, the jungle had hidden them, concealing cities that supported tens of thousands of people. Similar finds in the Amazon show earthworks and geoglyphs stretching for miles. Civilizations flourished, vanished, and were forgotten until technology peeled back the canopy. If the jungle can hide empires for 2,000 years, what could ice hide for 12,000? Geology provides more clues. Around 12,800 years ago, the Younger Dryas brought a sudden return to glacial cold. Black mats of carbon appear in sediments across North America, coinciding with mass extinctions. Gigantic floods surged as glacial lakes burst their ice dams, Lake Agassiz spilling torrents that reshaped the land. The Black Sea flood theory suggests a catastrophic breaching of natural barriers, drowning entire valleys. To those who lived through these cataclysms, the world would have seemed to collapse overnight. Cities and settlements, if they existed, would have been erased, leaving only myths of survival. The parallels with Sumer are striking. Their king lists speak of dynasties before the flood, kings reigning for tens of thousands of years. After the flood, reigns shrink to mortal scale. Civilization is reborn, but the memory of something vast lingers. Perhaps these stories were echoes of Ice Age cultures erased by climate chaos. Survivors may have migrated, carrying fragments of knowledge, astronomy, mathematics, myths, into new lands. When conditions stabilized, they rebuilt. The result was Sumer, dazzling not because it was first, but because it remembered. Imagine standing at the edge of a glacier in the Younger Dryas. The ice groans and cracks, rivers of meltwater surge. Entire valleys vanish under torrents of grey water. Families flee to high ground, clutching tools and children. Behind them, everything they built is consumed. They carry no monuments, no archives, only memory. Those memories, fragments of star lore, rituals of planting, charts of numbers, become their most precious inheritance. Thousands of years later, in Mesopotamia, those fragments resurface as systems that appear miraculously complete. Ghost civilizations beneath the ice remind us of fragility. They suggest that the record we possess is not the full story, but the survivor's version. Just as Doggerland's villages dissolved into sea, just as Amazonian cities lay hidden under canopy, so too might older cultures lie buried where we cannot yet reach them. Sumer's sophistication could be the visible crest of a submerged iceberg of human memory, most of it hidden from view. The unsettling thought is that we may never know. Antarctica's ice sheets may guard their secrets for millennia. Ocean floors may keep their drowned settlements beyond our grasp. Even if traces exist, time and geology may erase them utterly. Yet the myths persist. Flood stories, ancestral migrations, gods who taught forgotten arts, they are the whispers of those ghosts. When we see Sumer appear suddenly in history, already adorned with writing, law, mathematics, and architecture, perhaps we are not witnessing the first invention of civilization. Perhaps we are watching the reassembly of fragments carried from places long buried, ghost civilizations beneath ice and sea, whose names are lost, but whose memory endures in stone and story. Night descends over Mesopotamia, and the silhouette of a ziggurat cuts against the sky. Its massive tiers rise like a staircase toward the heavens, each level now broken by centuries of decay, yet still commanding the horizon. To stand at its base is to feel dwarfed not only by its height, but by the intention behind it. These were not random constructions. They were monuments aligned to forces far beyond the earth. When archaeologists measure these structures, patterns emerge. The great ziggurat of is oriented almost perfectly to the cardinal directions. Its stairways mirror the path of the sun, and the shadows it casts function like the hand of a clock across the plain. At Residue, the successive temples beneath the mound were rebuilt again and again to preserve not only a sacred space, but its exact alignment to the stars. Ziggurats, then, were not merely temples to house gods. They were instruments of memory, architecture bound to celestial rhythm. We find similar echoes far from Mesopotamia. In Anatolia, Göbekli Tepe's enclosures, thousands of years older, are thought to align with the rising of Sirius and other celestial markers. In Egypt, the pyramids mirror Orion's belt, their shafts aligned to circumpolar stars. In the Andes, Incan temples at Cusco and Machu Picchu track solstices with walls and windows carved into the rock. Across the globe, monuments link stone to sky, human ritual to cosmic order. The question is why? If civilization was merely invention, we might expect a variety of solutions, each culture experimenting in isolation. Yet the same impulse repeats: connect Earth to the heavens, encode astronomical knowledge in stone. The convergence suggests continuity, a shared inheritance. Perhaps each culture carried fragments of an older system, scattered survivors of catastrophe rebuilding from memory. Flood myths reinforce this. In Sumer, Ziusudra survives the deluge, preserving seeds of life. In the Bible, Noah releases birds to find land. In India, Manu is warned by a fish to build a boat. In Mesoamerica, ancestors retreat to caves and mountains to endure the waters. Each story follows the same rhythm: warning, survival, preservation, renewal. These are not just tales of divine wrath, they are memories of erasure and rebuilding, told and retold until they became sacred. The survivors did not pass forward blueprints of cities, they passed forward patterns of memory, how to align with stars, how to mark time, how to restart the world. This sheds light on Sumer's sudden brilliance. Writing, mathematics, ziggurats, and myths appeared whole because they were not born from scratch. They were echoes of an older harmony carried across floods and generations, reassembled in clay and brick. To us, they look like leaps. To them, they were restoration. Imagine standing in Uruk at dusk. The air is thick with the scent of clay ovens and burning reeds. Priests ascend the stairways of a temple carrying torches. Their chants rise into the evening, synchronizing with the appearance of Venus in the sky. Below, scribes etch numbers onto tablets, recording the star's cycle in base 60 notation. Farmers listen to rituals that dictate planting times, their instructions embedded in myth. Every act, from worship to work, ties back to the same pattern: human life aligned with cosmic order. Now imagine a night at Göbekli Tepe millennia earlier. Hunter-gatherers gather inside a ring of megaliths. The carvings of animals glow in firelight. Above them, the stars blaze, and priests gesture to their rising points. Stories are told, perhaps of a flood, perhaps of a teacher who showed them how to track the heavens. These stories are repeated, ritualized, turned into stone. Long after the people vanish, the pillars remain, carrying forward fragments of knowledge. The same echo travels through Egypt, where pyramid shafts align to stars that never set, through the Andes, where solstice light floods temple windows, through the Pacific, where Polynesian navigators read the sky like scripture. The pattern is everywhere: stone and stars bound together, as if all cultures were following the same ancient script. What does this mean for our guiding question? What if Sumer rebuilt human civilization from an ancient race? It suggests that Sumer's sudden order was not an isolated miracle, but part of a deeper cycle. Civilizations rise, are erased, and rise again, each time carrying fragments forward. The echoes are not identical. They shift and distort, but the rhythm persists. Stone remembers where memory fails. Stars provide the constant backdrop. Myths preserve instruction when libraries burn. Together they create continuity across collapse. In this light, Sumer was not unique. It was a keystone, a place where fragments coalesced after a great reset. Its scribes wrote down myths that had already been old when they first spoke them. Its priests aligned temples to stars that had guided ancestors long before cities existed. Its laws, its mathematics, its rituals were less inventions than restorations. They were echoes carried into a new age. This perspective transforms our awe. Civilization is not a straight line from primitive to advanced. It is a circle, repeating, each turn carrying traces of the last. What we see in Sumer is not a birth, but a rebirth. Its brilliance is a memory refracted through time, stone, and stars. And so, as night deepens, we return to the image of the ziggurat against the sky. Its shadow stretches across the plain, pointing like a sundial toward eternity. Its bricks whisper of Eridu's layered temples, of Göbekli Tepe's buried circles, of pyramids, of myths, of floods. All are connected. All are fragments of a song humanity keeps singing, even as verses are lost. The melody endures in echoes, carried by stone, guided by stars. Dawn spills across the Mesopotamian plain, the same light that once warmed Uruk, Eridu, and The reeds by the rivers bend as they always have, and the earth exhales silence over ruins that once held tens of thousands of lives. The story we began with, the sudden appearance of Sumer, complete with writing, laws, cities, and temples, feels less like a beginning now and more like a threshold. Perhaps not the first dawn of civilization, but the reopening of a door. We have followed the fragments, streets and drainage systems in Uruk that appeared without prototypes, cuneiform writing that looked perfect from the first mark, base 60 mathematics tuned to astronomy, still structuring our clocks today, ziggurats rising in repetition, aligned to the sky like instruments of memory, myths of gods as teachers, distributing the ME, packets of knowledge too precise to be invention, flood stories that mirror one another across the globe, preserving the image of a reset, a cylinder seal etched with a heliocentric cosmos, Göbekli Tepe buried to save itself, libraries burned and silenced, knowledge erased by conquest and neglect. All of it converges on one haunting possibility. Sumer did not begin civilization, it rebuilt it. From fragments of a race, a culture, a memory older than itself, something we can no longer name. If so, what does that make us? Each time we glance at a clock, we obey Sumer's numbers. Each time we map the heavens, we echo their astronomy. Our laws, our contracts, our rituals, all trace their ancestry to wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay 5 millennia ago. Yet even they may have been echoes. Civilization may not be invention at all, but memory, fragile, cyclical, always at risk of erasure. Picture a circle drawn in sand. The wind erases it. Someone redraws it. Again and again. Each time the form is familiar, yet details shift. The circle is never truly new, never truly old. It is always both. Civilization may be that circle, drawn by hands we no longer remember, erased by waters we cannot control, redrawn in Sumer, redrawn again in us. At the threshold of this thought, awe mingles with unease. If forgetting is the rule, what fragments are we leaving for those who will come after? What blueprints will remain when our archives dissolve, our languages fade, our monuments crumble? Will the survivors of some future reset rebuild from the echoes of our world, the way Sumer rebuilt from echoes of theirs? The door that opened in Sumer is not closed. It stands before us still, half in shadow, half in light. Beyond it lies not certainty, but memory, waiting to be remembered again. If you've walked this long path with me tonight, perhaps you feel that same silence, pregnant, deliberate, echoing with absence. Where are you listening from, and at what time? Share your place in the circle, and if these stories whisper to you, consider subscribing so we can keep walking together into the echoes of forgotten worlds. Because civilization may not be a mountain we are climbing, but a circle we are tracing, again and again, in stone, in story, in stars.